He stood in the silent boardroom as if waiting for a verdict. The screens along the far wall glowed with the same pale blue as his phone, which had not stopped buzzing for an hour. A half-finished model of the Yuyang Cultural Center sat on the table like a miniature of everything he'd built: glass towers, wooden promenades, a stepped plaza that faced Dongting's wide, restless water. Outside, the late afternoon air in the city smelled of printing ink and car exhaust. Inside, the hum of climate control felt like the last civilized sound before everything went quiet. Zhang Xingye read the message again. Partner withdrawal confirmed. Funds frozen pending review. He felt the words as a physical unmooring, floors sliding out from under a ship. He had always imagined crisis as numbers sliding on a spreadsheet. This felt like teeth separating from a jaw. The legal team said contingency. The PR team drafted messages that all sounded the same: regret, commitment to transparency, faith in due process. None of it fit the sudden hollowness that opened beneath him. The clip was short, shot by a live streamer with teenage hunger for scandal. Zhang and a stranger, an odd girl with hair like stray black silk and a tendency to smile with closed eyes, were in his car after a late meeting. The camera caught a slip of a moment. She reached toward his lunch, took a bite, closed her eyes, and when she touched his hand, something in his face softened into an expression the cameras loved because it was vulnerable and human. The headline wrote itself: CEO in intimate moment with a witch at company vehicle. By midnight, the clip had been stitched into commentary, the commentators rising in pitch like a chorus. He stared at the model until it blurred, then pushed his chair back and walked out into the corridor that smelled of coffee and stale urgency. He could hear the cadence of negotiation in the offices, voices meant to be calm now too loud with false certainty. He thought of the loan covenants, the board's delicate balance, the investors who had already given him room to fail once and expected him to be different this time. He wanted a plan. What he had instead was the shape of his own panic. Far from the glass and the alarms, by the muddy edge of Dongting Lake, a girl with inked brows sat on a low wooden stool at a street stall. Steam rose like a secret between her and the bowl in front of her, sizzling fish scent braided with the tang of tea. She ate with the impatient grace of someone hungry for both food and oblivion. Her name, what people called her, was Xiao Mao, officially Long Sun Young in the old registers that only older villagers bothered with. People whispered other names when they liked to make a story of things: the witch girl, the river child, the one who could look at the lake and make it listen. She stopped halfway through the second bowl, hand paused in the air. For a breath, she looked like anyone else, tired, small, the kind of face that carried yesterday's dust into tomorrow. Then she turned her palm up and watched it change color, a faint luster running beneath the skin like a fish caught by sunlight. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of something housed behind them, something that did not belong wholly to the village's ordinary time. When she was a child, they said she could call minnows with a song. When she was older, she could stand at the shoreline and the lake would tilt toward her as if listening. The stories gathered around her the way fog gathers around a boat. But her power was not a constant flame, it was a tide. It ebbed after days of being alone and thinned by doubt. Touch lit it. Food, shared simple bread, a bar of sweet rice, made it stronger. The rules were small and private, like the rules of old folk remedies grandparents held in palm. She guarded them the way one guards grief. The first spark of the story between them was accidental. He left the city to think. He told no one but his driver. His mind needed the lake that had once been a place of childhood solace. He expected only silence. Instead, the city's unraveling followed him like a shadow. A live stream had mapped the clip onto 1,000 tiny screens. Someone had posted a comment thread like dry kindling. A local influencer with a grudge against startups had turned the moment into a broadcast, and thousands watched the scandal bloom. Zhang had stopped the car by a roadside stall because the world had suddenly become too much and too small at the same time. He bought a bowl of fish soup and let the steaming aroma press him down toward ordinary breathing. He had not expected company. Xiaomo lifted her eyes at the sudden scrape of his chair, and for the first time he saw her, not a shadow in a clip, but a person who blinked as if to clear the camera's dust. She reached for the same bowl at the same moment he did. Her fingers brushed his knuckles. He stepped back reflexively, the kind of instinct born in boardrooms, not shoreline stalls. She smiled, an odd contraction that felt older than the village, and then her hand laid flat against his wrist. He felt, stupidly and irrationally, like an old coil had tightened around his chest and eased. There was a warmth that was not heat but resolution, and the list of his worries seemed to shuffle into a new order. For a second, he could breathe more cleanly. He drew back and blinked as if someone had taken a hand away from his face. "You looked like you needed it," she said in a voice like water over stones. Her touch had been nothing technical. It was not magical in the way pundits would define it. Still, the world felt different. Perhaps it was the calm of the lakeside, perhaps the steam of fish, perhaps the disarming human kindness of someone who didn't know his name. Or perhaps, in stories it is dangerous to enumerate reasons, things sometimes rearrange themselves when two unlikely things meet. They talked because silence had become intolerable for both. He learned she had a stubborn laugh and a tendency to hum old lullabies in the middle of the day. She learned he could not sit still when a problem had teeth. She learned that she called herself Xiaomao and that she had been living at the edge of the old town for as long as anyone could recall. When he left, she wrapped a paper package of tea leaves, Junshan tea, small golden curlings, in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into his hand. "For the office," she said, "you need warmth that is not news." He put it in his coat and forgot to tell anyone that he had met her. He forgot until the corner of the city he returned to smelled of the same fish steam, until a junior associate burst into his office with the latest flood of headlines. The model of the Yu Yang project suddenly looked fragile in light of the public's appetite for drama. Investors read headlines faster than they read financial statements. The first CTA, simple, human, unshowy, would have to come later. For now, his world was small and urgent. Partners asking for explanations, the board wanting an emergency meeting, suppliers asking for assurances. He had to act. But when the emergency meeting convened, when explanations were rationed like dry bread, the thing people whispered about above the more immediate numbers was the girl's hand on his wrist. It had become theatrical evidence of poor judgment. The press, that old hungry thing, had already written 1,000 endings. In the calm that follows a storm, a person sometimes makes a decision that feels reckless but is not. Zhang decided to defend the girl in a way that surprised even him. Not because he loved the scandal, he did not. He defended her because he had seen, in a truthless hour, a steadiness he had never expected. He drafted a message that used words like human dignity and resisting rumor, and he posted it with an attached image of the Junshan tea she had given him. Within hours, the reactions split into two camps, one mocking, one curious. One comment read, "He's gone soft." Another, "She's a mystery worth hearing from." They called a live stream to address the press, and as he prepared his remarks, he learned she would come. She insisted. "If you're going to speak, let me be there," she said. "If they want a story, we'll give them the honest one." He had expected a fury of cameras. Instead, the live stream had the intimacy of a living room. She sat slightly to his left, fingers folded over a cup, And when the host asked about the viral clip, she smiled and told a small version of her truth, that she had been hungry, that she had known the lake all her life, that she had no intent to scandalize. She said nothing about powers in conspiratorial whispers. She did not play the witch for the audience. The engagement of the stream came from her refusal to be a caricature. The numbers after the stream surprised everyone. Where scandal had once meant condemnation, this time curiosity crept in with a gentler beat. The view count climbed in large, clean numbers. People tuned in for spectacle and stayed for something subtler, her way of talking about place, the way she folded the Junshan tea leaves like a small prayer. Comments poured in that confessed to being moved. A few older villagers phoned local shows to confirm the stories. Some whispered of river dragon daughters and children who could sing fish home. The internet, which had been ravenous, now shifted toward appetite for authenticity. That shift mattered in practical terms. A small boutique investor who loved cultural projects unfroze a tranche of funds after he watched the live stream and booked an exploratory trip to Yeyang. A local tourism board, which had been wary of Zhang's ambitions because of concerns about gentrification, offered preliminary endorsement after seeing how straightforwardly the project could highlight local traditions rather than erase them. But the momentum was fragile. A rival, Mo Kuihua, circulated private photos manipulated into a campaign of disgust. Influencers smelled blood. The company's runway shortened. Zhang chose another reckless thing. He said no to an investor who wanted the story sanitized, wanted Xiaomao kept away and the local flavor replaced by glossy performances. Instead, he proposed a pivot. The entire project's heart would shift toward authentic experience. Market stalls, Junshan tea lodges, live storytelling at Yeyang Tower, community-led workshops. He argued it was what the place deserved and, more selfishly, what the project needed to survive. Some of the board balked. Others admired the courage and called it a gamble. Zhang called it a moral line. Xiaomao did not become a PR puppet. She refused the polished rituals that sanitized the living world. She taught the project teams how to listen to the stories elders told, how to prepare tea so that it had a memory of the hills, how to choreograph a tower viewing event that honored the lake's mournful voice. She moved through the construction site like a translator between old things and new, showing workers where to place a wooden rail to catch the evening wind in a particular way, asking the sound team to let the bell at the tower ring twice longer so the note would carry to the shore. Her presence altered the project's sensory vocabulary. The marketing team, initially skeptical, began to weave these elements into language that felt honest rather than performative. They planned a showcase, a moon viewing night at Yeyang Tower, live-streamed with performances drawn from local tales and a tea ceremony that invited viewers online to share their own stories. The event promised to be a turning point. If the showcase stalled or was mocked, partners would likely flee. If it succeeded, the authenticity of the experience could not easily be unmade. It would be a test not only of investor confidence, but of an idea that cultural truth could be a foundation for commerce rather than a costume to sell. Preparation was a montage of small resistances and larger reconciliations. Villagers who feared gentrification came to meetings. Zhang listened instead of pronouncing. He walked into the village tea houses wearing the awkward humility of a man who has seen his own missteps. He sat with Aunt Shu, who had thin palms and a sharp laugh, and learned to pour tea the way the community had for generations. He watched Xiaomao teach a group of interns to hold their questions like embers, to ask elders about the right song to play when the wind comes from the north. He saw the project teams, who once argued over floor plans, learn to argue over what a place ought to remember rather than what it could sell. The months felt like a slow repair. They woven Junshan's scent into the promotional footage, not as a novelty, but as an act of allegiance, a commitment to local livelihoods. Online, the new content was less glossy and more alive. An old boatman recalled a prophecy he had once heard as a youth. A potter's hands shaped clay while telling the story of a dragon who left a scale on the lake bank. A seamstress embroidered a dragon's eye onto a banner as if remembering a prayer. People responded. Engagement metrics climbed steadily. A 40% increase in pre-booking inquiries in the week after the first teasers. A surge in local media coverage that emphasized collaboration rather than spectacle. It was not a miracle, but it was progress one decision at a time. Then the setback arrived like winter. Mo Kuihua, who had the kind of popularity that thrives on others' misfortune, orchestrated a sting. A young influencer, paid to provoke, accused the project of exploiting the witch girl's heritage for profit. Old rumors, carefully curated by those who feared change, were fanned into a small wildfire. An irate crowdfunding group accused them of cultural appropriation. A conservative faction demanded that the company terminate Xiaomao's involvement. The investor who had pledged exploratory funds withdrew with a terse email. Supply chains hiccuped as vendors feared association. It felt, briefly, as if they had chosen the wrong kind of courage. They were not only fighting public relations. Xiaomao, who had grown in strength with company and companionship, felt a different pull. An ancestral summons that came as a trembler under her toes and a voice like deep water suggesting she had to go home. The legend was clear in the way some things were clear. The daughter of the river would one day be called back. Within weeks of the showcase, foot traffic increased by measurable margins. Local guest houses reported a spike in reservations that translated into a 25% increase in bookings in a month. Junshan tea cooperatives saw higher orders as the project began to source locally. Investor confidence, fragile but growing, led to a renewed line of credit under stricter terms but available nonetheless. It was not instant prosperity, it was a slow mending. The blessing was in the recovery, not an unchecked windfall. Behind the numbers were small human moments. Zhang walked the promenade as locals who had once eyed his hard suit now invited him to sit and share tea. He met fishermen who had been suspicious, and they showed him their nets with the courtesy of people who guard their history. He watched Zhao Mao teach a child to fold tea leaves with the same patient dignity she used to hold in small vessels. He felt his own heart stitched together with a new sense of what his work could be. But the symbolic climax of the story was not merely financial, it was personal and mythic. The call for Zhao Mao to return was not a simple obstacle to overcome. It was ancestral duty, a voice deeper than politics or profit. The dragon realm, if there was such a place in truth, was real to her. She could feel its pull in the marrow of her bones. Staying with Zhang meant choosing a precarious human life full of messy compromises and public scrutiny. Returning promised a clean destiny, an ascendance, a reunion with blood and power, possibly a life of remoteness she had been taught to expect since childhood. The choice she faced made the earlier business decisions look small. Would she trade the certainty of legend for the slow, uncertain bloom of a human life? Would she let her own heart be the instrument by which an empire was restored, at the possible cost of losing herself to a world that would always ask questions? The dramatic tension is not exotic because of prophecy. It is human because every such decision requires a measure of sacrifice. On the night before the final investor meeting that would secure the project's future, she sat alone by the lake and let the quiet sound of water argue with the drum of her heart. The moon was a thin coin in the sky, and somewhere deep underwater there was the pulse of something older telling her that she had been called. She thought of the little victories, the elder potter who found a buyer for his cups, the dock boy who now had stable work, the interns who filed proposals about respecting songs as part of their work. She thought of Zhang, who had learned to listen not as a tactic but as a practice. She imagined, as cleanly as any image, a palace of water where her family waited with the dull patience of kings. The palace was not a place where choices had to be made. It was a place where destiny often solved the problem by making exit simple. She did not make the choice in one motion. She measured it in small acts. She wandered the market the next morning and shared a bowl of fish with an old woman who told her about a son who had once gone away and returned like a ghost only when he needed money. The woman's story was a knot Xiao Mao could not ignore. People return not because they are called, but sometimes because the world makes them tired of leaving. She watched a child pour tea for his mother with earnest clumsiness, and in that clumsy pouring she saw years lived and changed. She felt the weight of duty and the pull of love, and realized love itself could be a kind of duty. The final investor meeting was small and strange. The salon where they met smelled of paper and the faint metallic tang of city rain. The lead potential investor, a woman who had built her fortune in quiet, asked not for magic but for sustainability. She wanted models, governance, and community buy-in. Zhang answered with numbers. Xiao Mao answered with a simple description of the village's plan for shared ownership. They listened, skeptical at first, until Zhang invited the investor to Yuyang Tower. He promised an open invitation to see in person how the community had been woven into the project. They gave her time to decide. The investor needed a guarantee. She asked for an independent audit and the creation of a cultural trust. Zhang agreed. The investor signed a conditional term sheet, money that would only be released when governance guidelines were met. It was not the clean, unconditional rescue of a fairy tale. It was a covenant of accountability. Zhang took that kind of deal. He had learned, in the months of near collapse, that foundations built upon respect outlast foundations built upon spectacle. Between the meeting and the investor's final release of funds, the lake called again, not only to Xiao Mao, but to her family's ancient voice. There were rites that could summon, and they appeared in dreams as scales of polished silver, as a hallway of light beneath waves. The call was real in the internal geography of her life. For a time, she considered an answer that would take her away. She measured that answer against the reality she had helped construct, the potter, the seamstress, the dock boy. She thought of Zhang's steady, sometimes fumbling, practice of humility. She loved the life she had not chosen that had chosen her in return. In the end, she chose to stay, not because she rejected her ancestry, but because she reconciled it with the world she had begun to belong to. She negotiated the terms in the only way she could. She walked to the lake one last time with a bowl of Junshan tea and a carved charm of dragon bone that had been in her family for generations. She sat under the same moon and whispered a promise she would keep. The dragon realm, which had always loved the idea of its daughters exactly as much as it loved the drama of reclaiming them, agreed, on its own terms. It allowed her a form of anchoring that meant she could go to the river when she needed, could carry a small piece of it always, and yet choose to remain among humans. The choice was not empty. It required that she carry both worlds tenderly and defend one without dishonoring the other. When she returned to the village and to Zhang, it was with a new calm. The investor released funds in phased tranches. The cultural trust was formed with village elders on the board and strict protections that ensured local control over sacred customs and revenue sharing. Bookings increased, small businesses thrived. The company, chastened by the brush with loss, restructured to prioritize local partnerships over extractive models. It was not perfect, but it bore the mark of something built anew. They celebrated in small, human ways, an evening at the tower where a banner read, in stitched characters, "Remember." Villagers brought lanterns, the tower bell struck. During the celebration, a community marketplace opened where Junshan tea was brewed in simple kettles and people lined up as if in a ceremony. The live stream from that night showed not spectacle, but a slow communal joy. Comments on the stream ranged from wonder to disbelieving gratitude. The investor who had once left a terse message now attended in person and, with a humble smile, bought the first pot of tea. Romance threaded through the revived company like a secret payment. Zhang and Xiaomao did not declare themselves in grand gestures. There was no public wedding, no staged kiss. Their relationship unfolded as a commitment to small, consistent acts, coming to meetings together when it mattered, sharing bowls of fish on rainy days, defending community members against opportunism, laughing at private jokes that were too small for press lines. He learned to listen in a new way. She learned to negotiate budgets with a patience that sometimes surprised her. Love, in this telling, became less a coronation and more a practice. The empire he had built was not the same as the one he had once imagined. It had less of the gleam of control and more of the warmth of a place that paid attention. The restored company did not loft funds into speculative towers. It became a steward. It invested in Junshan tea cooperatives, in boat maintenance for local fishermen, in training programs that taught young people the craft of making traditional lanterns. These investments were not sops. They were structural changes that returned agency to the community. Metrics followed. Visitor satisfaction rose, local incomes improved, and the company weathered market storms more steadily because it now sourced strength from a network rather than a single personality. There were still detractors, of course. People who liked spectacle missed the old headlines. Mo Kuihua tried once more to provoke a scandal, but having been seen to push against a coalition that now included villagers, local business owners, and a cautious but engaged investor, the effort collapsed under its own smallness. The public, whose appetite for sensation had once been a danger, now consumed the project with a different hunger, curiosity for an integrated, honest narrative. In quieter scenes, two people on a small balcony watching Dongting unfurl in the early light, there were moments that spoke of blessing. The fishing boats glided like punctuation marks on a page. The bell at Yuyang Tower sounded once, then twice, a slow, resonant tone that felt like a concluding line. Xiaomao and Zhang stood shoulder to shoulder, neither pretending to have solved every problem, nor hiding that new worries would come. They simply watched as a place they loved healed a little. They held each other's hands, not because the world demanded it, but because the world had reminded them what steadiness felt like. The narrative arc from a frantic, empty boardroom to a reconsecrated cultural project that actually served its people is not a story of magic solving the impossible. It is the story of people making choices and bearing the consequences, of a CEO who learned to risk reputation for integrity, of a woman of mysterious lineage who chose human ties over an easy ascendance, of villagers who, given respect, turned suspicion into partnership. The fantastical elements, the dragon heritage, the shimmering scales, remain motifs that color moments, not instructions for life. They remind us that myth and commerce can coexist when one listens to the deeper rhythms of place. At the end, the company's books were not miracles. They were the result of persistent, honest work and partnerships renegotiated with care. The blessings came slowly: returned investment tranches, increased bookings, a sustained partnership with a cultural trust, and, most importantly, a community that felt the value of its own culture reflected back without being sold out. The human cost had been real. Some partners never returned, some relationships fractured, but the recovery was real too. It looked like clean water running into a basin, not a torrent that sweeps everything away. If there is an image to close with, It is not a golden crown, but a simple lantern at the tower, its light steady against the night. The bell rings. 2 hands press together around a cup of Junshan tea. She takes a sip, then passes the cup to him. He drinks and tastes something like peace. The dragon scale shimmer glows faintly in the lamplight, an admission of the extraordinary that no longer needs to shout to be believed. The restored empire is not measured only by spreadsheets, but by the network of small lives stitched into it. Blessings, in the end, are not gifts from a distant throne, but the slow accumulation of choices made together. If you love modern fairy tales that save empires, tap like and subscribe. Months later, stories would be told about how one viral clip nearly ended a company and how caring little acts rebuilt it. They would tell it in headlines and in tea houses. They would argue about who deserved credit. The truest accounts would be quieter. A potter paid fairly for his cups, a dock boy with steady work, a tea house that kept its door open late for elders who needed to talk. The scandal would become a footnote in a longer tale about listening. When the dust settled, when investments were steadier and the tower's bell marked celebrations rather than crises, Zhang sometimes stood alone on the promenade. He would watch the lake undo and reform the sky's reflection and think of the night his empire nearly folded. He would remember a girl who had different names and a hand that had rested on his wrist and changed his pulse. He would remember the way it was easier to be brave when someone else believed in the smallness of good things. Xiao Mao, for her part, visited the water and the city in equal measure. She taught the interns how to fold tea leaves properly and how to ask elders for permission rather than take stories as commodities. She kept a small charm of dragon bone near her heart and once a month walked the lake in silence, letting the water remind her that she belonged to both worlds. The company that rose from the brink of collapse did so because it learned to be less grand and more rooted. The blessings were not the sudden reversal of fortune the tabloids had promised. They were patience rewarded, trust earned, and the quiet proliferation of work that respected place. The last image lingers. Yuyang Tower lit against an evening sky, villagers and visitors sharing tea beneath it, the bell tolling a watchful, contented note. 2 figures stand together at the edge of the plaza, neither holy rulers nor subjects, only people who have learned that salvation, whether in myth or business, is often a matter of choosing to stay and build. Subscribe for more stories where myth meets modern life. Watch next for the behind the scenes of Yuyang Tower's revival.